What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 278 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about We3 by Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely. This is a 3-issue miniseries from Vertigo from, I want to say, the early 2000s, and this is the story of three cybernetic animal soldiers who escape from a government lab to try and find a better life for themselves. And you may hear the premise of this book, and you may say, oh, that wacky Grant Morrison, what will he come up with next? I think that this is one of the more subdued, real-world type stories that Morrison has ever worked on. There is a real-world precedent for this kind of thing happening in the real world. In the 1960s, there was a thing called Acoustic Kitty that American scientists worked on. They were trying to find a way to spy on the Russians, and so they did this operation on this cat, putting machine parts into it so that they could pick up transmissions and they could hear what was going on in Russia. They spent thousands and thousands of dollars on this cat, and then they set it loose, and it immediately got run over by a car. So this story, it may sound very fantastical and out there. It's really not as far-fetched as it sounds. Now, of course, Quitely and Morrison, they do amp it up a little bit to turn it more into a science fiction adventure thriller. So these animals, they have these really cool robot exoskeleton suits that are very capable of protecting them, unlike the real-life Acoustic Kitty. But it is, I feel like, very entrenched in the real world, which is not necessarily the case with just about anything else that Grant Morrison has ever written. I like this story quite a bit because Morrison is able to let Frank Quitely do the lion's share of the work. This is one of the more visual stories that I've seen Morrison work on. A lot of times with comics not just written by Morrison but other people, you will see a lot of words thrown on the page, sometimes unnecessarily so. Comic books are a visual medium, and I think with this story, Morrison realized that he didn't have to flood this book with a ton of words. You have three animal protagonists here. They do speak to each other in English. We do get to see them talk, but a lot of times we don't have to see them talk, and we don't see them talk. Let me see if I can find a really good example here. Here's one, a little disgusting, but here's a good page here. You don't really see that many words on this page because it's not needed. What we need to see is from the art, and it's conveyed with the artwork, so we don't have to have words saying, the dog, he hunts down this rat. We don't need to see that here. I like that Morrison is able to let the art do the talking, and he's working with an artist who is very talented and very strong enough that he is able to convey the story as we need to see it through the artwork. Frank Quitely's art here, I think, is very solid. I've always been a fan of Frank Quitely's work. You may not be, and that is totally understandable. I'm going to say something that may sound a little bit like an insult, but like I said, I'm a big fan of Frank Quitely's art. A lot of times his art feels very uneasy, like he portrays human beings in a way that is almost disgusting, especially in books like, I want to say, The Authority by Mark Miller or New X-Men by Grant Morrison. I think in those, a lot of times his artwork feels very gross. He will show stuff that's just like, ew, like that almost makes me want to throw up, but I don't, obviously. But I think here, his art is reined in a little bit because he is portraying animals, so we're not seeing human beings that are kind of gross. A lot of times, like, I'm thinking of that Cletus character from The Authority who is not a human being. He was very much a fantastical creature of some kind, but stuff like that is just really nasty and gross. He doesn't do a whole lot of that here. This is some of his more subdued work, which again is very fitting since this is one of Morrison's more subdued stories. So if you're usually not a fan of Frank Quitely's artwork, I would definitely recommend that you give him a chance here because I think that his art works here in ways that it might not work for you in some of his other stories. Morrison once called this story a Western manga, and I think that that is definitely an apt comparison to the manga genre. I don't want to say genre, but manga, Japanese comics. I've read some manga here and there. You know, just a couple weeks ago, I was reading Dragon Ball, and I think a lot of times the manga that I've read is not quite as wordy as the American comics that I tend to read. And getting back to Morrison letting the art do the talking here, I think that this being not necessarily a wordless comic book, but having a significant reduction of words that I normally see in American comics, that does lend itself to feeling like the Western manga that Morrison called this book. So I like this book quite a bit. I think that it's a very fast-paced read. You will read it in like less than an hour probably, maybe less than 2 hours, but I really like it quite a bit. It's a very strong book. It is a very touching book also. It's one of those very rare instances where I almost felt like crying, but because I am an emotionless robot, I didn't. But I really like this quite a bit. If you're a fan of Grant Morrison, you absolutely need this on your shelf. If you're not sure, if you're kind of on the fence about Morrison or Frank Quietly, I would say still give this one a chance. This is not your typical Morrison or Frank Quietly. There is stuff here that I really like that you usually don't get to see with Morrison or Quietly. So if you usually don't like those guys, I would say still give this one a chance. And if you've never heard of them, definitely give this a chance. So anyway, those are my thoughts on We3. I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.